The fluorescent lights of Mercy General's ICU in San Diego hum against antiseptic scrubbed floors where Laura Bennett moves through her shift like a ghost, each footstep deliberate, each breath measured. It's 6:41 a.m. on a Tuesday, and she's already completed the vital checks on 4 patients, reviewed the medication charts for another 6, and mentally mapped the 2 emergency exits in the West Wing. Muscle memory. Habit. Survival instinct dressed up as nursing protocol. She doesn't see the other nurses watching her anymore. Or rather, she sees them, catalogues their positions and moods the way she catalogues patient O2 saturations, but she doesn't let them see her seeing. The trick to disappearing is never demanding attention. Never laughing too loud at break room jokes. Never sitting down when others are eating lunch. Laura has spent 2 years perfecting the art of occupying a space without disturbing it, a skill that kept her alive in Kandahar and now keeps her safe in this hospital where nobody asks questions about the woman who volunteers for the overnight shifts and never mentions family. Her hands are steady as she inserts an 4-line into Mrs. Chen's wrist, 18-gauge needle, smooth insertion, no fumbling. The kind of precision that comes from doing this in a surgical tent lit by chemical glow sticks while explosions shook the walls. Mrs. Chen doesn't notice. She's terrified of needles, eyes squeezed shut, breathing shallow. Laura's voice is soft when she speaks. All done. You didn't feel a thing. It's the nurse voice, the one she's practiced in mirrors for 24 months, the one that sounds like someone who has never heard a Black Hawk rotor blade thud overhead and thought for 3 seconds that she was about to die. The ICU smells like copper-tinged antiseptic and something underneath it, the particular staleness of human suffering that no amount of cleaning can scrub away. Laura moves through it like it's her natural environment. She adjusts monitors, checks drip rates, writes notes in the meticulous block letters that make Dr. Sterling's jaw clench. Everything documented. Everything precise. Every medication, every vital sign, every observation recorded with the kind of detail that would make a JAG officer weep. She's unaware of being watched, though her training should have caught it. Dr. Sterling stands in the hallway outside the nurse's station, his $6,200 Rolex catching the harsh light, his tailored suit pressing against a frame that has never known hunger or heat exhaustion or the weight of a teammate bleeding out on your hands. He's observing Laura the way an accountant observes a ledger that refuses to balance. Her competence is a problem. In the 6 weeks since she arrived at Mercy General, she's questioned 7 medication orders, caught 2 billing errors, and documented inconsistencies in patient progress notes that should have been filed and forgotten. Last Thursday she flagged that a catatonic patient coded twice in 1 week but was somehow billing for stable recovery room care. Sterling had smoothed that over, the records had been updated, some files had gone missing from the chart, the attending physician had signed off on a revised timeline, but Laura kept copies. She actually kept copies, which nobody does anymore, which nobody is supposed to do. The 7:16 a.m. admission changes everything, though nobody knows it yet. The orderlies will bed 7 into the unit at 7:04 a.m., and the man on it looks carved from granite. 72 years old, military-bearing, even unconscious, the kind of presence that makes the air pressure change. A general. Unresponsive for 6 days, transferred from Balboa Naval Hospital with a sealed transfer note and minimal documentation. Cardiac monitoring required. Level of consciousness currently GCS 3, unresponsive to voice, unresponsive to pain. The paperwork says nothing about how he became mute, nothing about the combat deployment he was overseeing when something went very wrong. Laura approaches the bed with Dr. Sterling 3 steps behind her. She doesn't acknowledge him. She never does if she can help it, having learned that her mere presence seems to aggravate something in him, some invisible competition she doesn't understand and doesn't want to win. She performs the initial assessment with the muscle memory of someone who has done this in 1,000 variations, checking pupil response, assessing breath sounds, reviewing the monitor strips that track a heart refusing to fail but also refusing to fully live. And then she sees it. The general's jacket is folded on the chair beside the bed, and the lining is visible, deliberately reinforced, she realizes, sewn with the kind of care that comes from wanting to preserve something. A patch. Faded. Unit insignia she recognizes instantly. Special Forces. Kandahar roster. 2014 to 2016. Her breath catches. Actually catches. Not a sound, barely visible, but for one fraction of a second her hands pause in their methodical assessment of the monitor leads. She doesn't look at Sterling. She doesn't change her expression. She simply reaches over and carefully tucks the jacket into the bedside locker with the same precise movement she applies to everything else, her fingers lingering for one heartbeat, just one, on that faded patch. Then she turns back to the monitors and continues charting. The handwriting doesn't waver. The clinical notes are perfect. Patient presents at 0704, responsive only to deep pain stimuli. Pupils sluggish but reactive. Breath sounds clear bilaterally. Heart rate consistent at 62, sinus rhythm maintained. No external injuries visible. Recommend continuous cardiac monitoring, neuro checks every 2 hours, all protocols per JAG directive. Professional. Detached. Exactly what a good nurse writes when she's met a ghost from a life she buried. Sterling watches from the doorway, and what he sees is an ICU nurse, quiet, efficient, competent to the point of obsession. What he doesn't see is the way her jaw has tightened just slightly, barely perceptible unless you're looking for it. What he doesn't see is that she's charting everything about this patient with even more meticulous detail than usual, because some part of her brain that survived 2 deployments and 18 years of service is already running threat assessment, already cataloging every variable, already trying to figure out why this particular general ended up here and what it means that his son's commanding officer, the man her son mentioned in a phone call 3 months ago, is now 3 feet away and doesn't know it. Sterling's mind is working differently. He's calculating billing codes. He's considering that a catatonic general represents premium insurance coverage, extended ICU stay, family wealth probably desperate enough to authorize all kinds of expensive diagnostics. He's already thinking about how the private insurance company will fight the charges, which means he'll need documentation so perfect it becomes unassailable, which means he needs nurses who chart so meticulously that every procedure becomes a small fortress of justification. He's also thinking about how Laura's documentation could become problematic if she decides to get curious about the timeline on this patient's condition, about why a combat-related injury is being treated as a civilian admission, about the missing military records and the sealed transfer paperwork. Laura's fingers brush the old scar on her left forearm, the one from Sanjin Valley, the one she never talks about. She catches herself doing it and stops. It's a tell. She knows better. But the feeling is there anyway, the muscle memory of being back in a surgical tent, preparing to operate on someone you knew, someone whose team you'd trained with, someone whose death would have meant failure in a place where failure meant body bags. She finishes the initial assessment at 7:23 a.m. The monitors are set, the 4 fluids running at the prescribed rate, the feeding tube positioned correctly. Everything documented. Everything perfect. And when she steps back from the bed, she doesn't look at the jacket again. She doesn't need to. She already has the patch's image burned into memory alongside 1,000 other things she's trained herself not to think about while helicopters pass overhead and her hands shake and she pours another cup of bitter hospital coffee at 3:33 a.m. and pretends she's just tired instead of terrified. Sterling makes a note on his phone. The competence will be useful until it becomes dangerous. He's handled competent nurses before. There's always a way to manage a threat like that, especially one that's so quiet it doesn't even realize it's making him uncomfortable. He smiles, the kind of smile that's supposed to be professional but sits wrong on his face, and walks back toward his office where the billing codes are waiting and the insurance company payouts are already being calculated and nobody's asking too many questions about timelines or documentation because his network of attending physicians and hospital administrators makes sure those kinds of questions never quite make it to the surface. The ICU settles into its daytime rhythm. Monitors beep at their regular intervals. Nurses move between beds. The fluorescent lights buzz their endless electric hum. Laura charts another set of vitals on the mute general in bed 7 and thinks about the wooden box in the back of her closet at home, the one with the medals inside, the one her teenage son has never been allowed to see, the one she was supposed to throw away 2 years ago when she accepted that her old life was supposed to stay old. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she was watching this man, this unconscious general, and something in her recognized something in him. Something that said he'd seen what she'd seen. Something that meant whatever happened to him out there in the field, whatever brought him here mute and unresponsive, it was the kind of thing that didn't come with an easy answer or a clean resolution. It was the kind of thing that followed you into hospitals and quiet shifts and homes where nobody knew who you used to be, and it found you anyway because that's what the past does. It finds you. And nobody, including Dr. Sterling, had any idea that he'd just admitted one of the most dangerous women in the hospital to the same unit as his newest billing opportunity. The morning rounds at Mercy General always started at 6:15, when the attending physician swept through the ICU like sharks moving through reef waters, and Dr. Sterling had perfected the choreography of domination down to the exact moment when families felt smallest. He arrived at the general's bedside with his entourage, 2 residents, a medical student, and the patient's daughter, who'd driven down from Los Angeles the night before. Laura was checking the ventilator settings, her hands moving with the precision of someone who'd done this exact task 10,000 times, when Sterling's voice cut through the monitor beeps like a blade. "Nurse checklist here has some concerns about our prognosis," he announced, using the nickname for the first time, letting it land in front of everyone. The medical student actually flinched. Though I'm not sure her community college certification covered neurology. The general's daughter opened her mouth. Closed it. The kind of silence that happens when people realize they're witnessing something they shouldn't speak about. Laura took one measured breath. She did not look at Sterling. She did not look at the family. She continued documenting the oxygen saturation, 94%, stable, exactly as it had been for the past 2 hours. Her pen moved across the chart without tremor. "Tell them your theory," Sterling pressed, his voice climbing toward performance now, the theatrical cruelty of a man who'd learned that humiliation in front of witnesses creates a kind of permanent stain. "Explain to these people how you think you know better than a physician with 20 years of experience." That was when Laura's jaw tightened just slightly. A muscle flexed once, then released. She turned to face him, and something in her eyes, something cold and measured and utterly devoid of apology, made the medical student take a small step backward. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave, precision replacing deference. "His pupil response is sluggish on the left. Your chart notes reactive bilaterally." She paused. "Let that hang. That inconsistency suggests increased intracranial pressure. I was noting it for the attending." Sterling's face reddened like someone had turned up the thermostat. "You were overstepping. Wildly overstepping. Stick to vital signs, nurse checklist. Leave the thinking to the physicians." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and swept from the room, his resident scrambling to follow, and the general's daughter looked at Laura with something like sympathy in her eyes before a nurse escort hurried her away for the family consultation. Laura stood alone in the ICU bed space. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical breath. She felt a single tear form, not from fear, not from shame, but from the kind of precise, controlled rage that Special Forces soldiers learn to weaponize. She wiped it away without breaking her own eye contact with her reflection in the monitor screen. What happened next didn't involve another confrontation. It was quieter. Worse. 2 days later, Laura sat in the break room with a turkey sandwich and a copy of The Nightingale she'd been reading on her lunch break. The room smelled of stale coffee and the antiseptic that never quite washed off anyone's hands. She'd been there exactly 90 seconds when the first nurse stood up, mentioned something about charting. Then another. Within 3 minutes, the break room had emptied like someone had called an evacuation order. She sat alone, sandwich in front of her, and heard Sterling's voice carry through the hallway outside. "Some people just don't have the temperament for critical care." The silence that followed told her everything. The whisper campaign had begun. Thursday morning, Laura clocked in at 5:58 a.m. The break room had been empty again yesterday. Today, there was a notice on the unit board, the kind that gets printed on official letterhead and posted where every staff member would see it during the morning huddle. Laura's vision narrowed. She read it once. Then again. Disciplinary notice, Bennett, medication error, morphine dosage discrepancy, patient 7B, 2,300 hours Wednesday. She had not been assigned to patient 7B. She had not administered any morphine to any patient that shift. She had been in the trauma bay for 6 hours stabilizing a post-operative coronary artery bypass patient who'd started bleeding out from a graft site. The charge nurse knew this. The medication log would show this. Every record in the hospital would prove this was fabricated. Sterling had made a choice. He was not going to outcompete her clinically. He couldn't. She was better, so he was going to destroy her credibility instead. The kind of competent villainy that makes things worse than simple rage ever could. Laura photographed the notice with her phone. Her hands were perfectly steady. She didn't even need the photo, really. She had copies of every medication log, every patient assignment, every moment of that shift documented in her meticulous charting. Sterling had just made a mistake. He'd assumed she was the kind of nurse who didn't keep records. He'd assumed she'd panic. The charge nurse avoided her eyes when Laura approached the desk. The attending from the day shift suddenly became very focused on his computer screen. By noon, the whisper was that Laura had been sloppy, that Sterling was being generous with his investigation, that she'd been making mistakes for months but nobody had wanted to be the one to report her. That afternoon, an assistant summoned her to Sterling's office with the kind of neutral tone that meant bad news was already decided. His office smelled like expensive cologne and the particular staleness of a space that never got fresh air. Sterling sat behind his desk like a man who'd already won, his fingers steepled, his smile the kind that carnivores wear. "This pattern of protocol violations cannot continue," he said, sliding a suspension letter across the desk toward her like it was the final move in a game he'd been playing since the moment she'd recognized his incompetence. Laura picked up the letter. 3 days. Pending investigation. Effective immediately. The medication error, she said quietly. Patient 7B. That's correct. I was not assigned to that patient. Sterling's smile widened. You were. I have the staffing log. I have the assignment sheet. I have everything I need. He paused. Let the silence work for him. Your badge. I'll need it. Laura set the letter down. She unpinned her badge, Bennett, L.R.N., from her scrub pocket. The plastic was worn from 2 years of double shifts and 16-hour days holding dying people's hands while they coded and came back and coded again. She set it on his desk. The sound it made was small. Final. You should know, Sterling said, and his voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who'd already checked every exit, that I've made some calls. References. People I know who might hire you. I've shared concerns about your competency. Laura stood. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Both of them already understood what he'd done and what it meant. She turned and walked to the door. And checklist. Sterling called after her. Don't bother coming back. I'll have security escort you out if you try. She collected her personal belongings from her locker, a photo of her son at his graduation, a pair of backup sneakers, a dog-eared copy of a medical journal with notes in the margins. The nurses on the unit avoided her gaze as though her suspension were contagious. The charge nurse suddenly needed to check the medication count. The residents found urgent reasons to be elsewhere. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Laura Bennett had been systematically erased from the daily life of Mercy General Hospital. Her badge was deactivated. Her access was revoked. Her reputation had been rebuilt in 20 minutes into something that would take years to undo, if it could be undone at all. She drove home in the San Diego afternoon traffic, her suspension letter on the passenger seat, and tried to believe that she'd left all of this behind when she'd quit the military. That PTSD and loud noises and the weight of command decisions had been put to rest in the quiet of hospital work. But that wasn't the worst part. Because 90 minutes after she'd cleared her locker and walked out through the emergency room doors, the general's chest x-ray from the morning shift would reveal something the radiologist had marked as probably artifact. A shadow. A whisper of something near the pericardium. The kind of finding that gets dismissed by busy physicians and missed by tired residents. The kind of finding that kills patients when nobody's paying attention. And Laura would be at home, drinking coffee and staring at her suspension letter, completely unaware that the one person in the entire hospital who'd recognized the danger would soon have exactly one chance to save a life before everything came crashing down. Dr. Sterling's office was smaller than Laura expected, which somehow made it worse. The afternoon light filtered through Venetian blinds, casting thin shadows across his mahogany desk like prison bars. He didn't ask her to sit. She remained standing, her hand steady at her sides, the fabric of her scrub still damp from the general's room. "Your suspension is effective immediately," Sterling said, not looking up from the termination letter. "The board has reviewed your incident report, and given the circumstances surrounding your unauthorized intervention during a suspended status, we have no choice but to recommend immediate termination for cause." Laura took one measured breath. She'd heard worse in interrogation rooms in Kandahar province, heard it delivered by men whose names she'd never know, whose faces would blur together over 18 years of operations she couldn't discuss. She'd heard it from superior officers during classified briefings about soldiers lost to friendly fire, about extraction teams that arrived too late, about surgical units compromised by intelligence failures. This was just words. A single tear escaped down her cheek, not from fear or shame, but from the accumulated weight of 2 years of silence, of burying herself in the anonymity of double shifts and quiet competence, of watching her son grow up wondering why his mother flinched at helicopters and never spoke about where she'd been before the ICU. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her jaw tight but her voice level, measured, cold as a surgical suite at 0300 hours. "I've seen what cowardice looks like in a dozen war zones, Doctor, and it always wears a smile." The words hung between them like shrapnel suspended in air. Sterling's face flushed red, not with shame, but with the particular rage of a man realizing his manipulation had struck something immovable. His hands tightened around the pen he was holding. "You're terminated," he said, his voice now sharp, desperate. "Sign the acknowledgement form, and security will escort you to collect your personal items. You have 15 minutes. Laura signed with the same steady hand that had performed a pericardiocentesis 3 hours ago, the same hand that had guided a needle through the pericardial sac while residents froze and alarms screamed and a general's heart stopped beating. The pen made a soft scratching sound against the paper, the only noise in the room besides the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical drone overhead. She left the hospital at 5:19 p.m., still wearing her scrubs, still smelling of antiseptic and the copper edge of adrenaline that hadn't fully metabolized from her bloodstream. The San Diego sun was already sinking toward the Pacific, painting the parking lot in shades of amber and rust. She didn't cry in the stairwell. She didn't sit in her car with her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She drove home in silence, her mind already cataloging what she'd lost, not just the job, but the constructed life, the careful architecture of normal that she'd spent 2 years building to escape the nightmares and the hypervigilance and the way her entire nervous system still lived in Kandahar even though her body had returned to civilian life. By the time she reached her apartment in Ocean Beach, the sky had darkened to navy blue. Her son, Marcus, was doing chemistry homework at the kitchen table when she walked in at 6:15 p.m., still in her scrubs, still smelling like a hospital. He looked up, saw her face, and the color drained from his own. "Mom? Why are you home?" She couldn't answer. The words wouldn't form. She moved past him to the kitchen table and sat down, her keys clattering onto the surface with a sound like dropping a weapon she'd carried for too long. Marcus watched her, frightened by something he'd never seen before, his mother broken, diminished, real in a way he'd never been allowed to see. "I need some water," Laura said quietly, though she didn't move to get it. Dry humor, the kind that comes from having survived worse and knowing that laughter was sometimes the only honest response to absurdity. "I'm going on a break." Marcus didn't understand. He went back to his chemistry, but his eyes kept drifting toward her, confused and worried. 90 minutes into her suspension, with the sky now fully dark and the apartment quiet except for the sound of the ocean 2 blocks away, Laura stood in front of the bathroom mirror and made a decision. She told herself it was about collecting her personal belongings from her locker at Mercy General, her phone charger, her nursing credentials, the small laminated photograph of Marcus at age 7 that she'd taped to her locker door 3 years ago when she'd first started at the hospital. She told herself she'd forgotten to pick them up during the escort out, during those 15 minutes while security had walked her to the employee parking lot like she was a theft risk, a liability, a threat to be contained and expelled. But that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that she'd left something in the general's room, something that no one else had noticed, something that only she would understand. The faded unit patch sewn inside the jacket lining, the one she'd recognized the moment she'd helped move him to the bed. A SEAL Team 3 insignia, the kind that only came from men who'd operated in the same theater, the same timeline, sometimes the same extraction zones. Her son's commanding officer. A man who had no voice to explain why his chart showed a cardiac tamponade that everyone else had missed because they were too busy watching her get humiliated, too busy following Sterling's lead into believing that a competent nurse was somehow incompetent. She drove back to Mercy General at 8:04 p.m., parking in the visitor lot instead of the employee section because she was no longer an employee. The doors to the ICU required a badge she no longer possessed, but the evening shift was busy, a trauma admission, an emergency intubation in Bay 6, and when she slipped through behind a nursing assistant carrying supplies, no one noticed. Her locker was on the 3rd floor, and she moved through the corridors with the fluid, invisible precision of someone who'd spent 18 years learning how to enter spaces without being seen. The monitor alarms were what stopped her. She was 3 feet from the stairwell when the sound hit like incoming fire, not one alarm, but a symphony of them, a cascade of warnings that meant only one thing. The general's monitor was screaming. A flat line. Cardiac arrest. The ICU's response was immediate but wrong, residents moving without purpose, the on-call cardiologist calling for a crash cart, a junior nurse fumbling with the defibrillator pads, no one moving with the kind of trained precision that meant they'd seen this specific condition before, understood the exact pathophysiology of what was killing their patient. Laura was already moving. Her locker, her belongings, her civilian life collecting dust in a personnel file, none of it mattered. She pushed through the double doors to the general's room, and what she saw in that moment confirmed what she'd known since the moment she'd recognized his unit patch. The hospital had no idea who they were treating, what they were losing, how close they were to failing the one patient who might matter more than all the others combined. The room went dead silent when she entered. Not because she announced herself, but because her presence carried the kind of authority that doesn't require words. She'd spent 18 years learning how to move like this, with the terrifying fluid precision of an apex predator, with the calm that comes from having already survived the worst that Kandahar could deliver. The resident stepped back without being told. The crash cart was 3 feet away, and she saw immediately what everyone else had missed: the general's chest was wrong. The movement was asymmetrical. The breath sounds were absent on the right side. The cardiac tamponade wasn't just pressure around the heart, it was catastrophic, and it was happening now. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway at exactly 8:07 p.m., his face going pale as he realized what Laura was doing, what her presence meant, and how completely his calculated destruction of her credibility was about to unravel in front of the entire hospital. The needle moved with the kind of precision that only muscle memory could provide. Laura's hands didn't shake. They never did. Not under fire, not in Kandahar, not now while Dr. Sterling watched from the doorway with his face draining color like a punctured-for bag. She didn't acknowledge him. The general's chest cavity required her complete attention. The cardiac tamponade was compressing his heart, blood pooling in the pericardial sac, killing him with every second that passed. The 14-gauge needle slid through the xiphoid approach, angling toward the right shoulder. Her movements were surgical, economical, the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. The hiss of air escaping as fluid pressure released from the sac. Oxygen saturation climbed. 68, 72, 79, steady. The general's color returned from ash gray to something approaching human. Laura kept her breathing regulated, her focus absolute, while around her the frozen residents finally seemed to remember they had jobs. One of them fumbled for a sterile dressing. Another was already calling for the OR. But Sterling was gone from the doorway. Laura finished the procedure with the same methodical precision she'd used to perform thoracotomies with nothing but field shears and adrenaline in Kandahar's dust. The general's heart rate stabilized at 94 beats per minute. His sinus rhythm held steady on the monitor, a rhythm that said he would live because she had been there when everyone else had frozen. She didn't expect gratitude. She didn't expect recognition. What she did expect, what she understood with the bone-deep certainty of someone who'd seen how institutions protect their own, was that Sterling was already moving against her. The next 6 hours happened exactly as she predicted. Sterling was in his office at 8:36 p.m., his fingers moving across the keyboard with the frantic energy of a man who realized his calculated destruction of her professional reputation had just become irrelevant. He was rebuilding her file into evidence of her instability. Performance reviews were being altered from exceptional to borderline competent. Verbal warnings for incidents that never occurred were being added to her personnel record with dates and timestamps. His hands moved like a pianist trying to rewrite a symphony into a funeral dirge. He picked up his phone at 9:03 p.m. and called Board Chairman Matthews. "We have a serious situation," Sterling said, his voice carrying the kind of manufactured concern that sounded almost genuine. "The nurse we discussed, Laura Bennett, she's become a serious liability. She violated her suspension order, practiced without authorization, and I'm frankly concerned about her judgment. I'd hate for the hospital to face regulatory exposure because we didn't act decisively." Matthews, who owed Sterling for overlooking a $400,000 billing discrepancy 3 years ago, made a note. At 9:17 p.m., Sterling called an external investigator he'd worked with before, a consultant who'd helped quietly dispose of several inconvenient complaints about his practices. "I need a quick assessment," Sterling said. "A nurse is claiming she performed a critical procedure while under suspension. Violation of medical protocol. Possible negligence. The timeline will be crucial." The investigator, who understood how these calls worked, understood what answer Sterling wanted and how much it was worth. By 10:31 p.m., Sterling had accessed and modified 17 personnel files. The automated monitoring system at Mercy General flagged the activity at 10:33 p.m. 2 FBI forensic accountants in the basement of the San Diego field office were already tracking the pattern, the same Sterling who'd kept catatonic patients sedated for days beyond medical necessity to maximize insurance billings was now desperately rewriting records at a pace that made his guilt obvious to anyone looking. Laura didn't know any of this. She knew only that she was home, in the kitchen of a small house in Pacific Beach that she'd bought with deployment bonuses she'd never discussed with anyone, sitting at the table in her scrubs at 11:27 p.m. when her 17-year-old son found her there. She didn't cry often. The PTSD had trained that response out of her years ago. Tears were a luxury you couldn't afford when your hands needed to steady. But her son found her with her head in her hands, her shoulders moving in the kind of quiet, controlled way that made it clear something inside her had finally cracked. "Mom." His voice was small. He was still in his school hoodie, still carrying that mix of adolescence and something older that came from having a mother who returned home some mornings with sand in her teeth and wouldn't explain where she'd been. "We need to talk." She lifted her head, composed herself in the way she always did, a breath, a pause, and then her face was steady again. But her eyes were red. "I can't talk about it, sweetheart. I'm sorry. There are things She stopped. "I lost my job today." He sat down across from her. For a moment, he was just a kid looking at his mother, and she could see him calculating the implications with the kind of sharp intelligence he'd inherited from her. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "I saw something," he said. "On your computer. About a year ago. A folder named Closed. You were in the hospital having your flu shot and you left it open. I shouldn't have looked, but," he paused. "I know what you were. I know what you are." Laura's hands went very still. "There's something in the attic," he continued. "In the back corner. A wooden box. The lid has a unit patch burned into it. The same patch that's in your nightmares when you have them." His voice was steady but his hands weren't. I need you to listen to me. I need you to trust me. She didn't ask how he knew about the box. Teenagers noticed things. They understood that parents have secret architectures. Okay, she said. Tomorrow morning. 10 a.m. Mercy General. Administrator's office. Don't ask why. Don't tell me you can't come because you're banned. Just come. Bring nothing. Say nothing until I tell you to speak. He left before she could ask more questions. Laura sat alone in her kitchen for 2 hours after that. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, rain began, the kind of San Diego rain that was rare and tentative, as if the sky wasn't entirely sure about committing to it. She didn't sleep. She returned to her computer, pulled up the folder her son had found, and stared at the photographs she'd never shown anyone. Images of her in desert camouflage. Images of deployments to Kandahar province that had aged her 15 years in 4. Images of medals she'd never explained and a life she'd carefully buried under 2 years of night shifts and quiet competence. At 7:48 a.m., she showered and changed into fresh scrubs. It was what she wore to hospital. It was what made her invisible. The administrator's office at Mercy General was on the 4th floor, past the executive suites where the real machinery of institutional power operated. Laura arrived at 9:55 a.m., her ID already revoked, and she realized she was walking through the building as a ghost, fully present and completely unwelcome, a liability in scrubs. The chief nursing officer was already there, along with board chairman Matthews and 2 hospital lawyers. A termination hearing that had been in progress. Laura could sense it the moment she stepped into the room, the formal posture, the prepared statements, the resignation that had already been written in her absence. Then the door opened again and her son walked in, carrying a wooden box. The box was ancient. The leather binding was cracked with age. And the unit patch burned into the lid was from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a unit her son shouldn't have recognized, but he did. He set it on the table. "Mom," he said, and his voice only cracked once, "they need to see these." The lid opened. And everything Laura had buried began to surface. The wooden box hit the conference table like a gavel. Laura's son stood in the administrator's office where the termination hearing had just concluded, his jaw set with the same precision she'd taught him, measured, intentional, immovable. "Mom, they need to see these," he said firmly, and the box lid opened. Metal spilled across the polished mahogany. Bronze stars with their distinctive ribbon colors. Commendation ribbons. A purple heart with its faded violet silk. The administrator's face drained of color. The board chairman's pen stopped mid-note. Laura's son picked up her official file, the one she'd never shown him, never mentioned, never allowed to surface in the quiet life she'd built in San Diego. His voice cracked as he read, not from emotion, but from the weight of words he'd never spoken aloud. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett," he said. 3 bronze stars. 2 with the Vela device. For tactical medical operations in Kandahar province, 2014 to 2018. The trauma nurse, a woman named Chen who'd served as a field medic in Kandahar herself, reached for the file with trembling hands. She knew that unit patch. She knew what those dates meant. She turned the page and her voice dropped to barely a whisper as she read aloud, "Kandahar Province Field Surgical Operations. 18 combat deployments across 13 provinces. Medical leadership under fire. Casualty evacuation under active engagement." She looked up at Laura with eyes that understood everything the words couldn't contain. The door opened. A SEAL team leader who'd been visiting another patient, someone from the general's unit, had heard the commotion in the hallway. He stepped inside, saw the faded unit patch Chen had placed on the table, the one that had been sewn into the general's jacket lining, the patch that connected everyone in this room to something larger than a hospital. His face went still. He studied Laura for a long moment, and then he spoke with the precise cadence of someone reading a casualty notification. "Purple Heart for injury sustained while extracting wounded personnel under direct fire," he said quietly. "Navy Cross nomination. That comes from senior command only. That's the kind of medal that sits in a shadow box on a wall, not a personnel file. He looked at the administrator. Do you understand what you just fired? The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Agent Morrison walked in, the FBI investigator who'd been tracking Sterling's billing scheme for 7 months. She was holding a laptop, and her expression carried the weight of 17 falsified personnel files, 12 hours of document manipulation, and $230,000 in fraudulent insurance claims. Dr. Raymond Sterling, she said, her voice steady as a surgeon's hand, attempted to forge Ms. Bennett's personnel records at 2:16 a.m. this morning. She turned the laptop around. The screen showed Sterling's credentials logging into the personnel database, file timestamps, modification timestamps, everything documented and timestamped and irrefutable. He changed performance reviews. Invented disciplinary actions. Falsified medical documentation. The board chairman stood up. The administrator's hands began to shake. He did this, Morrison continued, because Ms. Bennett's intervention saved the general's life from a cardiac tamponade that Dr. Sterling failed to diagnose. Possibly deliberately. Because unconscious patients in extended ICU sedation generate significantly higher billing codes than conscious patients. She pulled up the insurance claims. $47,000 billed for 6 days. $31,000 of it fraudulent. Security footage appeared on the screen. Sterling in the drug dispensary at 3 a.m. 3 nights ago, overriding the automated dosing system. Continuing sedation that wasn't medically necessary. Keeping a conscious man unconscious because unconscious men don't ask questions and their families don't advocate and they stay sedated for longer stays, and longer stays meant higher billing. The general's daughter made a sound like something had broken inside her chest. We also recovered security footage from the ICU, Morrison said, from the day Ms. Bennett was suspended. The day Dr. Sterling told her she was incompetent. The day he publicly questioned her medical judgment in front of a patient's family. She paused. 43 minutes later, your suspended nurse recognized a fatal chart discrepancy that your senior attending physician missed, and she performed an emergency pericardiocentesis that kept your general breathing. The FBI agent looked directly at the administrator. Your hospital fired the person who saved this man's life to protect the person who was slowly killing him for money. The door burst open. Security arrived with handcuffs, but they didn't need to search for Sterling. He was walking in, having been summoned by hospital administration, still wearing his white coat, still carrying the weight of his certainty that his network of board members and favors and careful conversations would protect him. The moment he saw the medals on the table, the moment he saw Laura standing in her dress uniform, the uniform her son had brought to the hospital because she'd finally agreed to stop hiding, his face went white. Not pale. Not flushed. White. The color of blood draining from extremities. The look of someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse in real time. Dr. Raymond Sterling, Morrison said as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, you're under arrest for healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, and falsification of medical records. They walked him past the ICU. Past the unit board where the fabricated disciplinary notice still hung. Rubber gloves snapped as nurses stopped what they were doing. The charge nurse who wouldn't meet Laura's eyes during her suspension tore the fake write-up from the board, crumpled it, threw it in the trash. Sterling's voice cracked as he tried to speak, tried to assert authority that had already evaporated. I'm a physician, you can't. The elevator doors closed on his protests. Within 4 hours, the medical board suspended his medical license pending criminal trial. Within 18 months, Dr. Raymond Sterling's last known employment was teaching CPR certification courses at a community college in Chula Vista, San Diego. Minimum wage. No hospital would touch him. No practice would hire him. His name on every credentialing database marked with a single word, revoked. Laura didn't hear most of it. She was staring at her son, who now knew that the mother he thought worked a quiet nursing job had commanded combat surgical operations in Kandahar. That the hands that braided his hair had held arteries closed under fire. That the voice that sang lullabies had called in medevacs on secure military channels. That the woman who'd taught him to value quiet strength had earned medals for valor that required her to move through danger like an apex predator through tall grass. "Mom," he said, and his voice carried something she hadn't heard since he was small, the need for the truth. "Why didn't you tell me?" The composure cracked. Not publicly. Not in front of the board or the FBI or the nurses watching through the observation window. But here, with her son, it fractured like tempered glass under pressure. She sat down. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from release. From the weight of 2 years of pretending to be smaller than she was, quieter than she needed to be, less capable than every crisis required. "The helicopters," she said finally. "Every time a helicopter flew overhead, my hand shook so bad I couldn't hold a pen. I'd have nightmares about Kandahar that would wake me up on the kitchen floor not knowing what decade I was in. I was hypervigilant enough that I'd flinch at automatic doors." She looked at him. "I didn't walk away from the military because I wanted to. I walked away because the PTSD wouldn't let me stay. And I couldn't tell you about Kandahar because every time I tried to say the word out loud, I couldn't breathe." He hugged her, and she broke down completely. The tears came like they'd been waiting 2 years for permission. The stoicism that had kept her standing through Sterling's humiliation, through her suspension, through the hours of doubt, it shattered, and she let it. Because she was no longer hiding. Because her son finally understood why certain sounds made her flinch. Why she'd chosen a quiet ICU over the chaos of a combat hospital. Why she'd needed the light. 2 days later, the hospital administrator personally escorted her to the general's room. She'd changed into her dress uniform at her son's insistence, blues with the medals arranged in ascending order of prestige. Bronze Star. Silver Star. Purple Heart. The Navy Cross nomination ribbon. Everything she'd earned through service, both military and medical, finally visible. Finally real. The general had regained consciousness, and he'd been told everything. When she entered the room, his eyes found hers immediately, and recognition flickered across his face like a match striking, not of her face, but of something deeper. The bearing of someone who'd commanded under fire. The presence of a senior chief petty officer who'd kept people alive in the worst conditions on Earth. He gestured for his aide to help him from the bed. Laura tried to stop him. "Sir, you need to rest." He waved her off with the authority of rank, and muscle memory took over. She obeyed. She helped the aide support his weight, the general's legs shaky from days of sedation and paralysis, his breathing still labored from the intubation tube. But his eyes were clear. Present. Fully here. He knelt before her on one knee. Not a collapse. A deliberate, controlled descent. The traditional battlefield gesture of respect between warriors. The formal acknowledgement that exists in no manual, no regulation, no official military document, only in the hearts of people who've served with honor and recognize it in others. "Senior Chief," he said, his voice hoarse from the ventilator, the words forced through damaged vocal cords but clear as a command. "My life for yours." Laura helped him stand, both of them with tears streaming, both of them in full uniform, both of them finally acknowledging what they'd always known in the dark, that they'd earned their place in the light. The hero's journey doesn't always end with trumpets. Sometimes it ends with a nurse in an ICU at Mercy General in San Diego, finally allowing the world to know who she'd been all along. Finally choosing to heal in the light rather than the shadows. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If you've ever been underestimated and proven everyone wrong, hit that subscribe button. Comment below if you think Laura's redemption was earned. And share this with someone who deserves to know they're more valuable than they believe.